Spain discovered something about Elizabeth I that England tried to bury for 4 centuries. Spanish diplomats sent encrypted reports back to Madrid describing the Queen's body in ways that ended careers and sparked conspiracies. 7 words in one dispatch were so disturbing, the ambassador was recalled overnight. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what Spain found and why 3 doctors who examined Elizabeth's body died within a year of seeing the truth. When King Philip II of Spain proposed marriage to Elizabeth I in 1558, just days after she inherited the throne, he wasn't making a romantic gesture. He was initiating what would become the most intensive investigation into a monarch's physical body in European history. Philip had been married to Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, and when Mary died childless, he saw Elizabeth as his next opportunity to control England and bring it back under Catholic rule. But Elizabeth refused him, and that refusal transformed Spanish diplomatic efforts in London from standard courtly observation into something far more sinister. Philip ordered his ambassadors to study the English Queen with unprecedented scrutiny, to document every physical characteristic, every behavioral quirk, every detail that might reveal weakness or abnormality. These weren't casual observers or gossip-spreading courtiers. They were trained intelligence operatives with medical knowledge, men who had spent careers analyzing royal bodies across Europe to assess marriage prospects and political vulnerabilities. Their mission was explicit and chilling. Discover whether Elizabeth was physically capable of marriage and childbirth, and if not, find proof that could be weaponized to destroy her legitimacy. What they discovered over the following decades would fuel conspiracy theories that persist to this day. Observations so disturbing that some diplomats had their careers destroyed simply for reporting what they saw. The Spanish diplomatic machine in Elizabethan England operated with ruthless efficiency and terrifying precision. Every ambassador who arrived in London received the same briefing from Madrid. Elizabeth's body was a matter of state security for Spain, and every detail mattered. They were instructed to observe how she moved, how she spoke, how she carried herself in both public ceremonies and private audiences. They needed to note her height, her build, her hands, her facial features, the quality of her voice, the way she walked. Most importantly, they were ordered to watch for any signs that might indicate she was incapable of producing heirs, or that her claims of virginity were covering something more disturbing. The Spanish court maintained detailed files on Elizabeth that grew thicker every year, filled with reports that painted an increasingly strange picture. Diplomats noted that she stood taller than most men at her court, that her voice carried with unusual volume and depth, that her physical strength seemed excessive for a woman who supposedly spent her days in sedentary court life. One ambassador watched her hunt with such aggressive skill that it reminded him of male warriors rather than delicate noblewomen. Another recorded that she could dance for hours without showing fatigue, displaying stamina that seemed inconsistent with feminine fragility. These observations were compiled, cross-referenced, and analyzed by Spanish intelligence officials who began to suspect that something fundamental about Elizabeth didn't match what they expected to find in a queen. But the most valuable intelligence came from Spanish spies who managed to infiltrate Elizabeth's household staff, bribing servants and ladies-in-waiting to report intimate details that ambassadors could never observe directly. These sources provided whispered rumors that Elizabeth's monthly cycles were irregular or possibly non-existent, that her ladies noticed unusual characteristics when helping her dress and bathe, that physicians who examined her during illnesses reacted with visible shock and refused to discuss their findings. The Spanish compiled this information into secret dossiers that were kept locked in Philip's private chambers, documents so sensitive that only his closest advisors were allowed to read them. And as the evidence accumulated, a terrifying theory began to form in Madrid. What if Elizabeth wasn't avoiding marriage because of political strategy or psychological trauma, but because she physically couldn't risk a wedding night? What if the Virgin Queen wasn't guarding her virtue but hiding a secret that would destroy the Tudor dynasty if it ever became public? This question would drive Spanish foreign policy for the next 4 decades, turning their obsession with Elizabeth's body into a geopolitical crisis that nearly changed the course of history. The dispatch arrived in Madrid in 1563, carried by a messenger who rode for 2 weeks straight through France to deliver it as quickly as possible. It came from Don Diego Guzman de Silva, a respected Spanish diplomat who had served at multiple European courts and earned a reputation for careful, accurate reporting. De Silva wasn't prone to exaggeration or wild speculation. He was known for his measured analysis and professional restraint, which made what he wrote in this particular message all the more shocking. The report was encrypted using a cipher reserved for the most sensitive intelligence. the kind of security typically used for military secrets or information about assassination plots. Spanish codebreakers worked for hours to decipher it, and when they finally read the plaintext message, they understood immediately why De Silva had taken such precautions. 7 words in the middle of a longer diplomatic report stood out like a bomb waiting to explode. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. The phrasing was deliberately vague, chosen carefully by someone who knew his letters might be intercepted even with encryption. But to trained intelligence readers in Madrid, the meaning was unmistakable. De Silva had observed something about Elizabeth's physical appearance that disturbed him deeply enough to risk his career by putting it in writing. Something that didn't match what any experienced observer would expect to see when looking at a queen. Within 48 hours of that dispatch arriving in Madrid, Don Diego Guzman de Silva received urgent orders to return to Spain immediately, abandoning his post in London without explanation or proper diplomatic closure. The speed of his recall was unprecedented and sent shockwaves through European diplomatic circles. Ambassadors typically served for years at foreign courts, building relationships and gathering intelligence over extended periods. To yank someone out so abruptly suggested either a massive security breach or that he had reported something so explosive that Madrid couldn't risk him saying more. De Silva left England within a week, and his diplomatic career effectively ended the moment he stepped off the ship in Spain. He was never posted to another foreign court, never given another position of significance, essentially exiled to obscurity for the rest of his life. The official explanation was that he had requested retirement due to poor health, but everyone in diplomatic circles knew this was nonsense. De Silva was in his prime, healthy and capable with decades of productive service ahead of him. The real reason for his sudden removal was obvious to those paying attention. He had seen something, reported something, that was too dangerous to allow him to continue operating in England where he might observe more or share his findings with other diplomats. The encrypted dispatch that destroyed his career was buried deep in Spanish archives, where it remained hidden for over 300 years, only discovered by historians in the 20th century, who finally understood its significance. But De Silva wasn't the only Spanish diplomat whose observations about Elizabeth led to career destruction. Between 1558 and 1580, at least 4 other Spanish representatives in London sent similar reports using carefully coded language to describe physical abnormalities they observed in the English queen. Each time, the pattern repeated. The report would arrive in Madrid, be read by Philip and his closest advisors, and the diplomat would be quietly recalled and reassigned to positions far from England where they couldn't cause further problems. One ambassador wrote about Elizabeth's masculine bearing that defies natural expectations for her sex, and within months found himself posted to a minor German principality where his talents were wasted on trivial negotiations. Another mentioned her unusual physical proportions inconsistent with womanly form, and was subsequently sent to manage administrative duties in Spanish territories in Italy, never again trusted with sensitive diplomatic work. The Spanish court was systematically removing anyone who got close enough to Elizabeth to observe details about her body, not because these diplomats were incompetent or unreliable, but precisely because they were too competent, too observant, too willing to report uncomfortable truths. Madrid wanted intelligence about Elizabeth's physical condition, but they also needed to control who knew that information and prevent it from spreading beyond the tight circle of officials managing Spain's long-term strategy against England. What those officials were planning would require keeping Spanish suspicions about Elizabeth's body absolutely secret until the perfect moment to weaponize that knowledge arrived. In 1568, a young English Catholic exile named Francis Englefield compiled a comprehensive report for King Philip that brought together all the scattered observations and rumors about Elizabeth into one devastating document. Englefield had been a member of Queen Mary I's household before fleeing to Spain when Elizabeth took the throne, and he maintained extensive intelligence networks among English Catholics who resented Protestant rule. His report, titled Concerning the Physical Nature and Marital Capacity of the English Queen, ran to over 50 pages and systematically catalogued every suspicious detail Spanish agents had gathered. It described Elizabeth's unusual height and build, her masculine voice and mannerisms, her aggressive physical activities that seemed inconsistent with feminine delicacy, the rumors from household servants about her lack of monthly cycles, the shocked reactions of physicians who examined her during illnesses. But Englefield went further than simply listing observations. He proposed a theory that would change how Spain approached the Elizabeth problem. What if she wasn't capable of consummating a marriage because her body wasn't properly female? What if the Virgin Queen's famous refusal to marry wasn't political calculation, but biological necessity? a desperate attempt to hide an anatomical abnormality that would be discovered on any wedding night? This theory became the foundation for Spanish strategy over the next 2 decades, driving everything from marriage, negotiations designed to trap Elizabeth into situations where her refusal would seem suspicious, to propaganda campaigns that questioned whether she was truly a woman at all. The Spanish were no longer just observing Elizabeth. They were building a case against her, accumulating evidence for a revelation they planned to unleash at exactly the right moment to maximum devastating effect. When Princess Catherine of Aragon married Prince Arthur in 1501, the 15-year-old bride knew exactly what would happen the morning after her wedding night, and the knowledge terrified her. She had been raised in the Spanish court where royal weddings followed strict protocols designed to prove the legitimacy of dynastic marriages. The wedding night itself wasn't private, romantic, or gentle. It was a political transaction that required physical evidence and witnesses. On her wedding night, Catherine was escorted to the marriage bed by a procession of ladies-in-waiting, who undressed her in front of assembled nobles and church officials. Arthur was brought in separately, blessed by priests, and the couple was left alone in the bedchamber while witnesses waited in the antechamber outside, listening for sounds that would confirm consummation. The next morning, the sheets would be inspected by these same witnesses, examined for blood that would prove Catherine had been a virgin and that the marriage had been properly completed. These weren't merely customs or superstitions. They were legal requirements, documented procedures that created official records necessary for validating royal succession. Without proper evidence of consummation, a royal marriage could be challenged, questioned, or annulled by rival claimants who wanted to dispute inheritance rights. The blood-stained sheets became legal documents in their own right, sometimes preserved for decades as proof that heirs born from the marriage were legitimate. Catherine's wedding night became one of the most controversial moments in English history because of what happened the next morning when witnesses examined those sheets. Multiple testimonies from Spanish attendants who were present claimed the sheets showed no blood, no evidence of virginity broken, no proof that Arthur had successfully consummated the marriage. This absence of blood became critically important decades later when Arthur died young and Catherine was married to his younger brother, who became King Henry VIII. When Henry wanted to divorce Catherine in the 1520s to marry Anne Boleyn, he argued that his marriage to Catherine was invalid because she had already been married to his brother, citing biblical prohibitions against marrying your brother's wife. Catherine countered that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, that she had remained a virgin throughout those brief months of marriage, and therefore the biblical prohibition didn't apply. The question of whether blood appeared on the sheets of Catherine and Arthur's wedding night became a matter of international diplomacy, with Spanish and English witnesses giving contradictory testimony about what they had seen that morning. Spanish attendants swore the sheets were clean, suggesting Catherine remained a virgin. English witnesses claimed they saw blood, proving consummation. The dispute dragged on for years, involving testimony from people who had been present decades earlier, all trying to remember details about fabric they had glimpsed briefly in candlelight on a single morning. The whole crisis demonstrated how much depended on those sheets, how a few drops of blood or the absence thereof could determine the fate of kingdoms, the legitimacy of heirs, and the course of religious reformation. This was the system Elizabeth I was born into, the world she inherited when she became queen in 1558. She grew up knowing that royal marriages required physical proof, that wedding nights came with witnesses waiting outside, that sheets would be examined and discussed by courtiers and diplomats who needed to verify that proper consummation had occurred. She watched her father Henry destroy multiple marriages, execute 2 wives, and turn England's religious identity upside down because of disputes about marriage validity and heir legitimacy. She saw firsthand how much power rested in the ability to prove or disprove what happened in royal bedchambers, how testimony about wedding night sheets could bring down queens and destabilize dynasties. And she must have understood from a very young age that she could never allow herself to be put in that position, never risk a wedding night that would require the morning after examination. Because if witnesses inspected her sheets and found them bloodless, the questions wouldn't stop there. They would want to know why. They would demand medical examinations to determine if there was something wrong with her body, something that prevented normal consummation. And any examination would reveal what she had spent her entire life hiding, the secret that Spanish diplomats suspected but could never prove without getting her into a situation that required physical verification. So Elizabeth made a choice that must have seemed insane to everyone around her. She would never marry, never produce an heir, never provide the succession security that everyone begged her to establish. Not because she was politically calculating or psychologically damaged, but because she physically couldn't risk what marriage would require her to expose. The Spanish understood this dynamic perfectly, which is why their marriage proposals to Elizabeth always included explicit demands about consummation verification. When Philip II proposed in 1558, his ambassadors made clear that any marriage agreement would require immediate consummation, with proper witnesses and mourning after confirmation, according to traditional protocols. This wasn't unusual or insulting in the context of royal marriages, but it put Elizabeth in an impossible position. She couldn't agree without risking exposure of whatever anatomical secret she was hiding, but she also couldn't refuse outright without raising suspicions about why she feared the standard procedures. So she played for time, using every diplomatic trick available to delay making a definitive answer. She suggested she needed more time to consider that the political situation in England required her attention first, that she wanted to meet Philip personally before agreeing to marriage, even though royal marriages were routinely arranged without the couple ever meeting. The Spanish saw through these delaying tactics immediately and began to suspect that Elizabeth's stalling wasn't about politics at all, but about her desperate attempt to avoid a situation where her body would be examined and judged. This suspicion led them to propose other marriage candidates, each time including the same insistence on traditional consummation protocols, essentially trying to trap Elizabeth into either agreeing and being forced to expose her secret, or refusing in ways that would make her reasons obvious. But Elizabeth proved more skilled at diplomatic evasion than the Spanish anticipated, managing to keep marriage negotiations alive for decades without ever committing to any arrangement that would put her in a bedchamber, with witnesses waiting outside and sheets ready for morning inspection. By 1570, the Spanish ambassador in London wrote to King Philip that he was now convinced Elizabeth would never marry anyone, and the reason had nothing to do with political independence or Protestant policy. He believed she was physically incapable of consummating a marriage, that her body held some abnormality that would be immediately obvious to any husband and any witnesses examining wedding night sheets. This assessment changed Spanish strategy fundamentally because if Elizabeth couldn't produce heirs, then England's succession crisis would eventually solve itself, and Spain just needed to position Catholic claimants to take advantage of the chaos that would follow her death. But the Spanish wanted more than just to wait for Elizabeth to die heirless. They wanted to expose her secret while she was still alive, to destroy her legitimacy and justify Spanish intervention to restore Catholic rule. And they thought they found their opportunity when rumors reached Madrid about a young man claiming to be Elizabeth's secret son, born from a liaison with Robert Dudley and hidden away to protect the Queen's virginity claims. If the Spanish could prove Elizabeth had borne a child, it would shatter her virgin queen image and potentially provide evidence about her anatomical condition. The investigation that followed would become one of the strangest episodes in the entire Spanish-English conflict, revealing just how desperately both sides were willing to go to either prove or disprove the secrets of Elizabeth's body. Arthur Dudley walked into a tavern in northern Spain in 1587 with a story so explosive that local authorities immediately arrested him as either a spy or a madman. He claimed to be 26 years old, born in England in 1561, and the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Under normal circumstances, such a claim would be dismissed as the delusions of someone seeking attention or suffering mental illness. Dozens of people across Europe periodically claimed to be secret royal bastards, hoping to gain money or prestige from the association. But Arthur Dudley's story had specific details that caught the attention of Spanish intelligence officials, details that aligned disturbingly well with events documented in Spanish diplomatic reports from England during the early 1560s. He described how Elizabeth had become pregnant in late 1560 during a period when she was involved in an intense relationship with Robert Dudley, causing panic among her counselors who feared the scandal would destroy her reign. He claimed that as her pregnancy progressed, she was hidden away from public view under the pretense of suffering from a mysterious illness that caused her body to swell, explaining away her growing belly without admitting the truth. He said he was born in the royal palace in July 1561 and immediately taken from his mother, handed to a servant named Robert Southern who raised him in secret, never telling him his true parentage until Southern lay dying years later, and finally revealed the shocking truth about Arthur's origins. What made Arthur Dudley's story credible enough to warrant serious Spanish investigation was that his timeline matched documented historical events with suspicious precision. In late 1560 and early 1561, Elizabeth did suffer from what was officially described as a mysterious illness that caused her to retreat from public life for several months, Diplomatic reports from that period noted that she appeared in public infrequently, that when she did appear, she wore unusually voluminous gowns even by Tudor standards, and that rumors circulated in London about her being gravely ill or possibly dying. One Spanish ambassador wrote that the Queen's condition was being kept secret with unusual intensity, that her physicians were refusing to discuss details of her illness, and that speculation was rampant about what was really wrong with her. The ambassador noted that Elizabeth's body appeared to have undergone significant changes, though he couldn't specify exactly what those changes were without proper examination. Then, in July 1561, Elizabeth suddenly emerged from her seclusion looking dramatically thinner, claiming to have recovered from her mysterious malady. The timing aligned perfectly with Arthur Dudley's claimed birth date, and Spanish intelligence officials recognized immediately that if his story was true, it would explain not only the suspicious illness, but potentially provide physical evidence about Elizabeth's anatomical capacity for childbirth. If she could bear a child, then her body must be functional enough for marriage and reproduction, meaning her refusal to marry was purely political rather than based on physical impossibility. The Spanish transported Arthur Dudley to Madrid for intensive interrogation conducted by Francis Englefield, the same English Catholic exile who had compiled the comprehensive report on Elizabeth's physical abnormalities years earlier. Englefield spent weeks questioning Arthur, documenting every detail of his story, cross-referencing his claims against Spanish intelligence files on Elizabeth's movements and activities during the relevant time periods. 3 letters written by Englefield during this investigation survive today in Spanish archives, and they reveal a man genuinely uncertain about whether Arthur Dudley was telling the truth or spinning an elaborate fiction. Englefield noted that Arthur knew details about the interior layout of English royal palaces that would be difficult for a commoner to know, that he could describe specific courtiers and servants by name and appearance, that his account of being raised by Robert Southern matched records showing that a man by that name did serve in Elizabeth's household during the relevant years. But Englefield also noted inconsistencies and gaps in Arthur's story, moments where his timeline didn't quite align with documented events, details that seemed suspiciously convenient for someone trying to fabricate a believable royal origin story. The investigation concluded inconclusively, with Englefield writing that he believed Arthur Dudley genuinely thought he was Elizabeth's son, but couldn't determine whether Robert Southern had told him the truth or invented the story for reasons unknown. The Spanish ultimately decided they couldn't use Arthur to definitively prove anything about Elizabeth's body or her virginity claims, but his case remained in their files as suggestive evidence that perhaps the Virgin Queen wasn't quite as virginal as England claimed, that maybe her anatomical secrets included not just unusual physical characteristics, but actual capacity for childbearing that she had utilized at least once. But the Arthur Dudley investigation revealed something more significant than whether he was actually Elizabeth's son. It showed how desperately both England and Spain needed to control information about the Queen's body. When news of Arthur's arrest and interrogation reached London, Elizabeth's government went into crisis mode, sending urgent messages to Spanish contacts demanding information about what Arthur had claimed and what evidence he had provided. English intelligence agencies worked frantically to track Arthur's movements before he entered Spain, trying to determine whether he was a genuine threat or a Spanish plant designed to spread disinformation. The fact that England took his claims seriously enough to launch their own investigation suggested they feared he might possess knowledge or evidence that could damage Elizabeth's carefully maintained image. Meanwhile, Spanish officials debated how to use Arthur strategically, whether to publicize his story and use it to attack Elizabeth's legitimacy, or keep him secret as leverage for future negotiations. The decision to investigate him privately rather than immediately announcing his claims publicly showed that Spain valued the potential intelligence about Elizabeth's body more than the immediate propaganda value of exposing a possible illegitimate child. Both governments understood that the real prize wasn't proving or disproving Arthur Dudley's parentage, but gaining definitive evidence about what Elizabeth's body could or couldn't do, whether she was capable of the marriage and childbirth that royal duties required, or whether she was hiding physical abnormalities that would disqualify her from queenship if they became public knowledge. This obsession with Elizabeth's anatomy had become the driving force behind decades of diplomatic maneuvering, and it wouldn't end until one side finally obtained the proof they needed to either attack or defend the Virgin Queen's legitimacy. The Ridolfi Plot of 1571 represented the moment when Spanish suspicions about Elizabeth's body transformed from intelligence gathering into active conspiracy to overthrow her regime. Roberto di Ridolfi was an Italian banker with connections to both Catholic and Protestant European powers, making him the perfect intermediary for covert communications. He carried coded messages between Mary Queen of Scots, imprisoned in England, and Pope Pius V in Rome, with copies going to King Philip in Madrid. The plot involved coordinating a Spanish military invasion of England with an internal rebellion led by English Catholic nobles who would assassinate Elizabeth and replace her with Mary, who would marry Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, creating a Catholic power base that would restore England to papal authority. But what made this conspiracy different from other Catholic plots against Elizabeth was the specific reasoning the conspirators used to justify her removal, reasoning that went beyond religious disagreements and struck at the fundamental question of her fitness to rule based on physical characteristics. The decoded letters, intercepted by Elizabeth's spy master William Cecil and preserved in English archives, reveal that the conspirators believed Elizabeth was biologically unfit for queenship, that her body itself proved she was cursed or marked by God as unsuitable for sovereignty, and that replacing her would be divinely sanctioned because nature itself had disqualified her. One particularly damning letter from a Spanish military commander discussing invasion plans included a passage describing Elizabeth as the mannish queen whose form betrays the wickedness of her heretic rule, whom God has marked in flesh as he is marked in soul, unfit for the crown she stole. This wasn't generic religious propaganda about Protestant heresy. This was specific, detailed language suggesting the conspirators possessed intelligence about Elizabeth's physical abnormalities and believed those abnormalities were evidence of divine displeasure. Another letter from an English Catholic noble to Mary Queen of Scots mentioned that evidence of the pretender's unwomanly nature grows more certain with each report from those close enough to observe what protocol forbids spoken, implying that information was leaking from Elizabeth's household staff about physical characteristics that didn't match normal female anatomy. The Ridolfi plotters clearly believed they possessed damaging intelligence about Elizabeth's body. Intelligence they thought would help justify their conspiracy by suggesting that removing her from the throne would be correcting a fundamental error, replacing a physically defective ruler with a proper queen whose body was unquestionably female and capable of producing legitimate heirs. The Spanish military involvement in the plot showed that Madrid took these anatomical suspicions seriously enough to commit resources and troops to an invasion plan that would capitalize on internal English doubts about Elizabeth's fitness to rule, based on physical characteristics that remained frustratingly hidden beneath her elaborate costumes and makeup. When William Cecil's intelligence network uncovered the Ridolfi plot and arrested the conspirators, the interrogations revealed just how much Catholic Europe had been obsessing over Elizabeth's body. Under torture, several of the arrested nobles and their servants admitted they had been instructed by Spanish agents to gather specific information about the Queen's physical appearance, to bribe household staff for details about her anatomy, to question physicians who had examined her during illnesses. One confession described being told to find proof that Elizabeth's body was incorrect for a woman, that discovering this proof would be worth more to Spain than 1,000 soldiers. Another conspirator admitted that Spanish handlers had promised enormous rewards to anyone who could obtain documentation from English physicians about Elizabeth's anatomical condition, suggesting Madrid believed medical records might exist that would confirm their suspicions. The Duke of Norfolk was executed for his role in the conspiracy, but the Spanish ambassador who had facilitated much of the plot, Guerau de Spes, was merely expelled from England rather than arrested or tried, because Elizabeth's government feared what he might reveal in a public trial about Spanish intelligence efforts to investigate the Queen's body. Despes returned to Madrid with detailed reports about English defensive weaknesses and military preparations, but also with updated assessments of Elizabeth's physical condition based on observations from bribed servants and household staff who had been promised Spanish protection and wealth in exchange for intimate information about their queen. These reports went into Philip's private files, adding to the growing dossier that would eventually be used to justify the massive military undertaking Spain was planning against England. The propaganda war leading up to the 1588 Spanish Armada revealed how thoroughly Spanish suspicions about Elizabeth's body had penetrated European consciousness. Spanish pamphleteers published broadsides and pamphlets that circulated throughout Catholic Europe, describing Elizabeth in terms that went beyond political or religious criticism and directly questioned her gender and anatomical normalcy. One widely distributed Spanish pamphlet from 1586 described her as the creature on England's throne, neither fully man nor properly woman, whose body is as twisted as her heretic soul. Another publication showed woodcut illustrations depicting Elizabeth with masculine features, broad shoulders, and ambiguous anatomy, accompanied by text suggesting that England was ruled by a monster who had deceived her subjects about her true nature. These weren't merely insults or generic propaganda. They were calculated psychological warfare designed to plant seeds of doubt in English minds about whether their queen was physically fit to rule, whether the woman they had followed for 3 decades might be hiding a secret that invalidated everything she claimed to represent. The Spanish understood that military invasion alone might not be enough to conquer England, that they needed to undermine Elizabeth's authority and legitimacy from within by making English subjects question the fundamental reality of who and what she was. If they could make enough people doubt whether Elizabeth was truly female, whether her virgin queen image was covering anatomical abnormalities, whether her refusal to marry indicated physical impossibility rather than political choice, then the invasion force would face weakened resistance from a population already uncertain about defending their queen. When the Spanish Armada finally sailed in July 1588, King Philip included in his invasion plans specific instructions about what should happen if English resistance collapsed and Spanish forces captured Elizabeth alive. The orders, preserved in Spanish naval archives, included a directive that she should be examined by physicians appointed by the Spanish crown to determine the true nature of her physical form and capacity. This wasn't about assessing her health or treating injuries. This was about finally, definitively settling the question that had driven Spanish obsession for 3 decades. Was Elizabeth anatomically normal for a woman? Or did her body harbor the abnormalities that Spanish intelligence had suspected since the 1560s? Philip wanted medical documentation that could be used to justify Spanish conquest retroactively, proof that England had been ruled by someone physically unfit for sovereignty, evidence that would legitimize Spanish occupation as correction of a fundamental error rather than mere military conquest. The examination order was explicit about what physicians should investigate, directing them to assess whether the prisoner possesses the organs and characteristics proper to her claimed sex, and if deficiencies or abnormalities are discovered, to document them with precision for presentation to His Holiness the Pope and the crowned heads of Europe. This was to be the ultimate humiliation for Elizabeth if captured, having her body examined, documented, and publicized by Spanish physicians who would provide the evidence that had eluded diplomats and spies for decades, finally answering whether the Virgin Queen's body matched her public image or concealed the abnormalities that Spain had long suspected. Elizabeth's famous speech at Tilbury in August 1588, delivered to English troops preparing to defend against the expected Spanish invasion, contained words that Spanish propagandists immediately seized upon as inadvertent confession. Standing before thousands of soldiers, Elizabeth declared, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She intended these words to inspire her troops, to acknowledge gender expectations while asserting her courage and determination exceeded those limitations. But Spanish interpreters read something very different in that phrase about having a king's heart and stomach. They argued she had accidentally admitted the truth, that her body wasn't entirely female, that she possessed masculine internal characteristics that gave her the strength and will typically associated with male monarchs. Spanish pamphlets published after the Armada's defeat used Elizabeth's own words against her, claiming she had confessed to having a king's body rather than a queen's, that her reference to masculine heart and stomach was an admission that her anatomy included male organs or characteristics hidden beneath her elaborate gowns. The fact that the Spanish clung to this interpretation even after their invasion fleet was destroyed and scattered by storms showed how deeply invested they were in the theory that Elizabeth's body was abnormal, that even military defeat couldn't shake their conviction that the English queen was hiding physical secrets that, if exposed, would retrospectively justify everything Spain had attempted against her. The propaganda campaign continued for years after the Armada disaster, with Spanish writers insisting that Elizabeth's survival and England's victory didn't change the fundamental truth about her body, that she remained a physical aberration on a throne, ruling through deception and concealment of her true anatomical nature. When Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603 at Richmond Palace, something unprecedented happened that validated every Spanish suspicion about how desperately England needed to protect secrets about her body. Within minutes of her final breath before anyone could pay proper respects or begin traditional mourning rituals, her private chamber was sealed by armed guards with orders that no one could enter or leave under any circumstances. This wasn't standard protocol for royal deaths. When Henry VIII died, courtiers flooded his chambers to witness history. When Mary I passed, nobles gathered to pay respects and begin planning the succession. But Elizabeth's death chamber became a fortress, locked tighter than military installations, with only a handful of the most trusted ladies-in-waiting allowed to remain inside to prepare her body for burial. The speed and intensity of this lockdown told everyone present that something was about to be revealed that could never be taken back. That the body being prepared for its final rest held secrets that required extreme measures to keep hidden. The counselors who ordered the chamber sealed gave the remaining servants one explicit, chilling command. Prepare the body, but speak of nothing you see, with clear understanding that treason laws would be enforced against anyone who violated this order. These weren't polite requests for discretion. These were threats backed by the executioner's block, delivered by men who understood that what was about to be discovered in that room could destroy England's stability if it became public knowledge while the succession remained uncertain, and foreign powers waited for any excuse to challenge the incoming King James's claim to the English throne. The maids who undressed Elizabeth's corpse encountered horrors that went far beyond what they expected from preparing an elderly queen's body for burial. Decades of wearing lead-based makeup had literally eaten through her face, creating oozing craters where healthy skin should have been. Her torso bore deep, permanent grooves carved by years of wearing corsets cinched impossibly tight, with visibly misshapen ribs that had cracked and healed improperly. But when they finally removed her undergarments and saw what lay beneath, the reaction was so extreme that one young maid vomited and had to be immediately removed from the room, taken far from London by armed guards who delivered her to a remote estate with a generous pension and an explicit threat about what would happen if she ever spoke about what she witnessed. The few vague accounts that survived from the other ladies-in-waiting, written decades later in coded euphemistic language by elderly women still terrified of treason charges, all agree on one essential fact. Elizabeth's anatomy was profoundly wrong, not as it should be for any woman. The body was wrapped quickly in layer after layer of treated cloth, then sealed in a lead coffin within hours while still warm, unprecedented speed that demonstrated desperate haste to close that coffin before anyone else could see what the maids discovered. The Spanish had been right all along. Elizabeth's body held a secret so dangerous that England spent 44 years hiding it behind elaborate costumes and cosmetics, and would spend the next 4 centuries making sure it stayed buried, sealed forever in a lead coffin, beneath Westminster Abbey, where modern science can never examine it without permission from authorities who have every reason to keep those secrets hidden forever. The Virgin Queen's greatest secret died with her, protected by the same system that had guarded it throughout her life, and the bloodless sheet scandal that Spain tried so desperately to prove remained tantalizingly out of reach, suggested by decades of evidence but never definitively confirmed, leaving us to wonder what those Spanish diplomats actually saw that made them so certain Elizabeth's form was not as other women's. If you made it this far, you need to hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel uncovers historical secrets that powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to bury. Leave a comment telling me whether you think Westminster Abbey should finally allow modern forensic examination of Elizabeth's remains, and let science solve this 400-year mystery once and for all. And smash that like button if you believe it's time. These royal secrets stopped being protected by tradition and started being investigated by truth. Because every tells the algorithm to show this to more people who deserve to know the real history that's been hidden behind official narratives for far too long.